This is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. I believe that we are experiencing an epic failure of the two political parties, giving us an inability to deal with some of our big problems in society. That's part of why I've been engaged with No Labels, who's formed a new party here in Arizona. This last Sunday, I attended the funeral of Charlie Kirk. Now, I didn't attend it because I'm a MAGA member, because I'm not. I didn't attend it because I'm a supporter of Donald Trump, because I haven't been. I attended it because there are a lot of people in our community who are hurting. I attended it because the life of a young man was taken needlessly and doing great damage to his family and our community. I attended it because there are a great many people in our community who are hurting based upon what happened. Now, in some respects, the funeral left us unable to deal with the really hard emotional issues that surround this. But in other ways, it was very inspirational. And we're going to talk about it on the show today. I think what the two parties have done, they've left us in this position where we can't see what's right with America. I wrote a book with that title. We can't see how these addictive ideologies are doing real damage to our society. I wrote a book with that title as well. But most importantly, I think that what we've done is we've forgotten the importance of being able to forgive. One of my heroes, Martin Luther King, gave a great speech about the importance of forgiveness and that the solution to hatred isn't more hatred. In this show, we're going to explore that, a show that we're titling Forgiveness. Now, if you like what it is that we do, I hope you'll push that subscribe button. But either way, let's get going with the show and we'll talk to our panel about not only what happened with Charlie Kirk, but we'll address other issues, including the economy and other topics that will follow. Thanks for being here.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and disticate and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, I'd like to welcome back both of my guests. We'll see if Elliot shows up today. You know, sometimes he pulls up in that little Porsche outside the studio and runs in and sits down and talks about the economy and other issues, but today he's at least late. But I will start with two of my favorites here. Let me start with Henry. Professor Thompson, how's it going today, Professor? And how's it at ASU?
Pretty good, thanks, Paul. Not a lot of news around here. I think that ASU's had a couple of big events around Charlie Kirk's shooting. I believe there was a memorial on campus last week that was very well attended, and I think also probably a lot of ASU students and affiliates were at the event yesterday. So that's probably the big news around the ASU campus at the moment.
Yeah, I was there also. I'll talk about that in a moment. Bob, how are you doing? You're up in Munns Park?
I am. We've had some unseasonal rain, but it's clearing up now. Fall has arrived in Munns Park, Arizona.
Yeah. All right. So let's start. Let's just jump right into Charlie Kirk's memorial. I think it was an important moment. And I'm going to kind of describe what I saw, what happened in my visit, and then we can kind of talk about a variety of elements that surround it. So I received an invite. I got put on a VIP list to be able to go to the memorial. I felt like it was just a matter of respect to go. I did. We were in a guy's box, a guy named Ernie Garcia, who I've liked for a very long time. He's very kind of bipartisan, works well with both sides. He's an incredibly good human being. But the box was filled up with people that I mostly knew that were certainly on the right side of the ledger. Some who were MAGA people, some who were business people or Trump people, but nonetheless, the box was filled with that. So as we are driving to the event, it's so full that our car, after sitting in line for an hour and realizing that they are emptying out every car's trunk, their luggage, everything. There's no way to be able to get your vehicle into where you should get it. We decided to just park and walk the last half an hour, 45 minutes. But when we got there, there were literally 3 or 4 bottlenecks to get into the building. It was just it was packed. There were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people trying to get in. So of course I'm in my tie and my suit, and it's nice and humid and sweaty, and so my suit is like sticking to me in different places. But nobody's complaining. Although around me are millions of, well, tens of thousands of MAGA hats. Right, they're just everywhere, and it was kind of interesting because a number of people recognized me. Some recognized me as the past mayor. Some pointed out the past Democratic mayor. And then other people recognized me from our podcast that make mention of something that was there. But the point I guess I'm getting to on that is, while they may have known me as a Democratic mayor, or even doing a podcast where they knew that at times I'm critical of Donald Trump, they were very nice. I mean, they were incredibly respectful. I'm having a little bit of fun with me, but they were being really decent and enjoyable. And I had some great conversations in that 2 hours or 3 hours that I was waiting to get in. When we got into the suite and started listening to the ceremony, I would start by telling you it was a wonderful ceremony. First, the music was great. They had a band that was doing, I guess it's Christian rock. I'm not sure that's the correct name for the genre, but it was very inspirational. It was upbeat. They were unbelievably good singers. And then they brought up the different pastors of Charlie Kirk who did a really good job. And they brought up his friends, people who were engaged in the effort that did it. By the way, one of the things that I would notice for people is this was a much younger crowd than you might have thought. There were a lot of young people in this room. Not a few. There were a lot of young people in this crowd. But in any event, then we got to the politicians. And, I would point out it's a hard place for a politician. I was saying to Bob before the show, if you talk about your policies and your issues, you look a little bit self-serving. If you talk about your faith or your Christianity, you look like, again, you're self-serving or you're pandering. So it's just not an easy spot for them to be in. But most of them did pretty well. You had Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance and Robert F. Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard. I enjoyed listening to them and listening to their spin. And most of them, for the most part, I think at times with the crowd, maybe they brought up some excitement, but some of it was a little bit flat. Not to be critical of them. As I said, I think it's a hard place for them to be. There were 3 speeches that definitely stood out. The first one was Stephen Miller. The guy is articulate. He's smart. He can string together sentences very well, but it is filled with hate. I mean, it was incredibly negative, mean, and undermining. And I don't think that he got the response that he hoped that he would get. But nonetheless, I thought his speech was far and away one of the worst. His widow, Mrs. Kirk, she spoke, and I can tell you it's maybe one of the most moving speeches that I've heard. And the reason that it was moving, she said a number of things that really caught my attention. One of them that was really hard to hear, and it had to be hard for her to say, was her describing seeing her husband's body for the first time after he was shot, and the horror that came from that, and the absolute sadness that she was experiencing. And she also talked about the anger, but she said there was something else there. And one of the things that she said was that the young man that shot her was exactly like most of the young men that Charlie had been trying to convert, trying to move over to accepting something better. And then the other thing that she said is she talked about her faith. She talked about how when Jesus was up on the cross, one of the things he said in the Bible is, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then she had this revealing moment where she talked about forgiving the shooter, forgiving him for what he had done, and forgiving the people who had made negative comments about it. I couldn't help it. I wept. I stood up. People were, they just immediately recognized the power in that concept of forgiveness. It was a speech that was almost out of what you would have thought of with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is certainly one of my heroes. But what I love about Martin Luther King is the fact that he talks about love as opposed to hate, and he talks about how we respond to these types of issues. In fact, one of my favorites, I think it was in the speech in Montgomery, where he spoke about this concept of we won't find the answer to these problems by making someone else by destabling other people. We're only going to find it by talking about the issues, and that we can hate the issues, but that we shouldn't hate the people. After that, Donald Trump came on. Now, when he came on there, you'll see we've got some pictures of this, but they have the fireworks, and the guy sings the song "I'm Proud to Be an American." The actual author or the singer of that, which he did a great job. But the crowd, it was a packed house. I mean, if you look down, I've got pictures of this, you will just see that it was wall to wall. Everybody was there. And then Trump starts the speech. And when he starts the speech, he does okay. He's reading from a teleprompter, as he should be, right? When you're doing a speech along that lines, you want to try to stay on script as best you can. You could kind of tell, though, when he would go off script, because he would look to the left, he'd look to the right, which is where the teleprompter is. But then when he would talk to the center, he would be going off script. He'd be talking about the things that he wanted. The speech had to be 3 times longer than his staff originally intended it, because he did a lot of impromptu speaking. And the more impromptu he became, the more negative he became. It was funny, as I was sitting there, I was having this feeling of wondering if I was in the right place. I'm not a Trump supporter, and I wasn't even somebody that would be called a Charlie Kirk supporter. I was there because I believed that it was important to be respectful, and I think Charlie Kirk did some good work, especially on the issue of free speech and making certain that we could have debates on campus. We could talk about concepts that are complex. I love that about him. But as I'm listening to Trump, I'm feeling like, well, gosh, maybe I'm not, I shouldn't be here. Maybe this is the wrong place. Maybe the way that I'm feeling about this isn't right. But I began to look around 15 or 20 minutes into this, and the room was emptying out. Now, I'll show you some pictures on this, but I'm telling you, 2/3 of this audience left. They said 1/3. You can look at these pictures that I took 15 minutes into it. It was 2/3 of the audience. Now, I'm not saying that they're mad at Trump or hate Trump or dislike Trump, but as I was walking out an hour later, because that's about how long his speech went on, the people who I was walking out with, they were extremely discouraged. I heard people with MAGA hats on saying, the guy just can't shut up. Not talking to me, talking to one another. There was, I think he let down many of the people who were there, but it was because it was a speech that was being symbolized by this concept that he said in it, that, Charlie Kirk forgives people. I don't forgive. I hate my enemies. As I sat there and listened to it and thinking about why I was there, I couldn't help it, but I went back to his widow. And I thought about how powerful her comments were, and maybe more importantly, that she had made the decision to forgive not only the guy who had done the shooting, but people like me who don't necessarily agree with Charlie on some issues. In that moment, for her to have that power, to be able to do that, made me ask myself the question, why can't I just forgive him for this terribly bad speech? And that's what I tried to do. Just forgive it. I do think it was a moment where we could have had something better. I really genuinely, before his speech, I was hoping that this would be not only a unity speech, but that he would be incredibly successful with it. Because I think our country needed it. We needed this moment to find a way to try to pull us together. But I think the challenge that we're going to face this time is Donald Trump has some wonderful attributes about him and things that he's very talented at doing. But one of them's not trying to pull us together. I don't think we're going to get that from this president ever. We have to find a way to do that without it and without him. So, in any event, I'd love to get your guys' input. Let's start with that. What you guys thought about the Charlie Kirk event, and I mean, besides the fact that it was horrific, and maybe what lasting scars or benefits that we get as a country moving forward. I'll start with you, Henry.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm glad you were at the memorial because I couldn't go. And so I'm glad that one of us was there. And it's really interesting to have a firsthand account because I think that a lot of the dynamics you describe, you can't see on the TV, right? At the footage of the speeches, etc. You can't really know what it was really like to be there. So that's really interesting. The Charlie Kirk shooting is a terrible tragedy. I feel awful for his friends and his colleagues and his family. I think it's a terrible thing, and it just reflects so poorly on the state of American democracy and American civil discourse that I think it's really sad. I think it's really sad. If I was going to try and take some sort of a consolation or some sort of a positive takeaway from this episode, it would be that I didn't know a lot about Charlie Kirk, but recently over the weekend and since the shooting, I went on YouTube and watched some of these videos of him debating college students on campus. And I have to say that he is very controversial. He doesn't shy away from the most controversial topics. He is happy to have extremely contentious debates with these students, even with students that massively disagree with him and get very upset when he disagrees with them. But he doesn't lose his temper. He negotiates or debates from some sort of rational standpoint, right? He tries to take people's arguments at face value. He tries to dissect them and find their weak points, tries to sort of show people the weaknesses of their own arguments, which in some ways is what debate is about. And sometimes when they make a good point, he's willing to concede, right, that they've made a good point against him. And so if I was going to try and take one positive away from this awful event, it would be that he could serve as a model for this type of contentious debate for young people on campus, but people all over America. And I really believe strongly that if people did more of this type of discussion and debate, that the country would be better off for it. It's bitterly ironic and very tragic that he was killed while he was trying to have one of these debates that I think are exactly what the country needs. And in some ways, that's what we're trying to do on this show. And, Rob, Bob, you know that you came to my class where we have these political discussions, right? Try and discuss contentious topics. So it's something I try and do in the classroom as well. So the fact that Charlie Kirk was killed doing something that I myself do in the classroom that I think is so important is deeply, deeply troubling to me. But I also don't think that we really have any alternative but to keep trying to have the types of debates that he quite often had with people he really disagreed with.
It seems as though these kind of tragedies just result in the same repetitive behavior. And we never move forward from them. One side blames the rhetoric of the other side. The other side talks about how the people blaming them for it engage in the same type of rhetoric. Some voices call for a more civil discussion. And then a month later, nothing has changed. And I think until we have institutional reforms which reduce the political incentive to demonize opponents, we won't move forward. There's nothing about even as heart-rendering a result or a tragedy as this, and something as moving as what you describe the widow's speech as being. There's just something about the current state of our politics, even though I don't believe that it's fair to draw a direct line between extreme political rhetoric and violent acts such as an assassination. Nevertheless, institutionally, there are incentives to engage in demonizing your opponent rather than trying to win a policy debate. And until we make the institutional reforms, I don't think we will do anything other than repeat the same pattern that we have after each of these tragedies.
So I'll give you my input into this, and Bob, I'm going to start with you on it. But I'm right now more disappointed with Democrats than I am Republicans, and I'm going to tell you why. They've been through this. Right? The governor home in Pennsylvania was burnt down. Them trying to kill the governor of Pennsylvania. They had a couple of legislators, important legislators in Minnesota, that were killed. They know with Gabby Giffords how this feels, and in most of those cases, they know that oftentimes when you go through that, you feel like it's not just the person that was killed that was under attack, but that your side is under attack. And in knowing that, they also know that oftentimes you can make the mistake, and they did, of blaming the entire other side for it, blaming everybody on the other side. Through all those lessons, they come to this one, and then they make the same mistake that the Republicans made when it was on the shoe was on the other foot, which is they have to add the but. Well, I don't think it's right that Charlie Kirk ended up being killed, but. And the answer is, you don't need a but. Stop. All right. This is a period of mourning. Their side is hurting. They're grieving. You know what that feels like. Why do you have to add the but? Why is this the right time for you to decide that you're going to have a political debate on Charlie Kirk? Why didn't you show up at the universities or take part in it beforehand? But even if you did, now's a period of time to be forgiving of the other side and to be understanding of the other side. And, I guess I'm more disappointed in watching Democrats on this than Republicans, because I know many of those people who were there, they really are grieving. They really do feel like they're under assault. They do feel like they're not being listened to. And that's understandable when you're in this type of moment. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's right that you blame the entire other side. But I tend to give more of a deference to the group who's going through the grief, going through the process of having to process this when it's somebody that they cared about. Your thoughts on that?
I would agree entirely with the disappointment and the apparent inability of politicians of either side to simply, as you put it, not include the but, and to not turn the event into trying to make some kind of a political point as opposed to simply expressing grief and sympathy for those who cherished Charlie Kirk. However, I can't say that I fault Democrats more, given what Stephen Miller and Donald Trump are trying to do with the event, which is to engage in a full-fledged attack, trying to censor and undermine liberal nonprofits. The one that the Democrats are doing is bad form, and I would say bad politics. What Trump and Miller are talking about doing is attacking the fundamental underpinning of American democracy, which is the right to engage in robust, critical political speech. And to me, that's the greater danger.
Yeah, I would just echo what Bob said in a way, which is that this all just seems to, in a matter of a few weeks, to just go back to normal, and we're back to partisan point scoring. And it's disappointing, but it's the system as we know it, right? And I think that it's just, it just brings to light how tragic this event is and how difficult it is to change the system, that you can have hundreds of thousands of people showing up at the stadium here for a memorial who are deeply moved and would love to see some change around politics and people's ability to debate and to discuss politics in a constructive, civil way. And yet, in the end, as Bob pointed out, the bigger incentive structures overwhelm any of those sorts of more noble tendencies towards ever increasing polarization and violent rhetoric and et cetera, et cetera. So this whole event does not reflect well on our democracy at all. It does not increase the standing of the United States in the world. It certainly encourages or gives heart to those authoritarian governments abroad that think that democracy is too imperfect to be tried and like to tell their populations that democracy means instability and violence. And it's a really sad thing that's happened with Charlie Kirk. I wish that it had never happened at all.
Yeah, I think one of the great comments at the event was that even after the shooting, you didn't see any rioting or violence from their side. What I really think Trump and Steve Miller miss, and maybe they just can't grasp it, but the constituency, the religious constituency that is in large part theirs. First, they are grieving, they are hurting, but there is a fundamental belief of forgiveness that's built into their religion. It's core to the secret of who they are. And that's what they were looking for. And when they knew they weren't going to get it, when they knew they were going to get politics as usual, again, I'm not saying they're walking away from Donald Trump, because I don't think they are. They don't like it. It's not what they wanted. They want to see something different. And I think the following is true. I think Democrats are missing that also. I don't think most people see this as the right moment to be talking about the but. I feel bad about this, but the majority of people in our country want something better than the discourse that we're getting. And the two political parties, they're just not giving it to them. And instead, they're utilizing it as a weapon. They're basically taking Charlie Kirk and making him a prop for their cause celeb, for the thing that they see as being important. And I do want to talk about that, because I think that it is important here that we not lose sight and vision of what Charlie Kirk's message was and the effect that his death may end up having. Because without spending time thinking about what his life was about, I think you also hold the potential of other people trying to misuse it. So again, Charlie has issues that I could look back on, and certainly I have disagreement on. As I said, Martin Luther King was one of my heroes. I'm not certain how that he felt the same way about him. But I do know this. Charlie Kirk loved free speech. There is no doubt in my mind about that. He loved going to a college campus. He loved setting up his little tent, and he loved having a debate with people. He was strongly driven by his faith. He wanted to try to bring people around to what he thought was the more moral, right way to look at things. But he was also willing to be challenged and to let people do and say things that might embarrass him. When you open up the mic that way and you do it hour after hour, somebody's going to embarrass you. Somebody's going to get the right pop. It's just the way it works, which is why many of the Democrats oftentimes don't want to do long-form content, right? Because they know in long-form content, they may get popped. Charlie was way beyond long-form content. He was out there just allowing, okay, the people who agree with me stand in this line, and the people who disagree with me stand in the other, and let's let the people who disagree with me go first. That commitment to free speech is maybe one of the most powerful American things that you can possibly do. Overwhelmingly. Trump right now is moving in the opposite direction. He's, this thing that he did with Jimmy Kimmel, and by the way, I don't watch late night comedy. I think all of them have become way too negative and way too partisan, and I don't like it. I think they're mean, and I like comedy, and I like people making fun of us and our politicians, but I don't want it to be mean or vile. However, saying that, there are some people who do like it. And if the network decides they want to keep him or lose him, I don't care. That's up to them. When the NFL said, I don't want to keep this football player that knelt during the flag raise, my answer is, your free speech doesn't extend to it destroying the other guy's business. But the minute the SEC chamber or chairman steps in and says, oh, hey, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, now it seems to me like we're crossing a line of free speech. And when you add behind that, I literally in the same week, he had a prosecutor who had to leave because he wouldn't prosecute Letitia James on a mortgage fraud. And then he's giving Pam Bondi grief because she's not going after his political opponents. It begins to look like he is definitely in a moment where he is trying to stifle exactly what Charlie Kirk believed was important.
Yeah, I have been giving some thought to this issue myself since Kirk's death, and our commitments to free speech, the tragic irony that Charlie Kirk, that was probably the thing that I remember most about him and respect the most about him, was this commitment, as you say, to risk embarrassment, to risk his own views being turned back against him and exposed as ignorant, right, in front of the whole world in the name of free speech and debate. I think that was the thing that I respect the most about him. Now, free speech has been under threat on college campuses and corporations and things now. It seems like for years that this has been a recurring theme. People are getting fired for posting blog posts at Google that are against DEI policies, for example. There's this famous case of James Damore years ago. Or that speakers would try and come to college campuses and they weren't sufficiently left-wing and they'd get shouted down, or the students would protest until they got uninvited, like Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, got uninvited from Smith College years ago for the high crime of being a quote-unquote neoliberal, whatever that means, right? So free speech has been under threat for a long time. Now you take this and you escalate it to the federal level, and you've got the Attorney General saying she wants to prosecute people for hate speech, and you've got the FCC threatening to take away TV licenses for people that say things they disagree with. This is obviously not a good idea. This is all counterproductive. You can explain this in that the Trump administration is angry about Charlie Kirk. Many of them knew him very well. They are maybe hot-headed and responding in an exaggerated way. But this is not a good idea. It just escalates these debates over free speech that I personally find retrograde and boring at this point. I am sick of talking about free speech. I wish we could just resolve this issue and all agree that free speech is a good thing and that we need more of it. But this topic is not going away. It seems to be getting worse. And I think this is one of the many things that we discuss on this show that is a fundamental problem with the functioning of not just American democracy, but many democracies around the world. So Charlie Kirk was a big champion of free speech. I think it was one of his most admirable qualities, probably his most admirable quality as a public figure. And it's just sad, really sad that he could be killed tragically while exercising that commitment to free speech on a college campus. It really it sends the absolute worst signal.
Bob, it occurs to me, I think that there was a lot going on the left that was closing down free speech and that was challenging, including sometimes threatening companies or individuals. Certainly we saw that with Biden on some of the COVID examples. But what Henry was just talking about to me was really probably the better example. We had this, you had this period where Barack Obama ended up winning the campaign. And I remember thinking about it. I was actually at John McCain's event that night when he was doing his concession speech, and the beautiful concession speech talking about the promise that Barack Obama gave to the rest of the country that said that anybody could, in this country, rise the level of being president, and the signal that sent out to Americans. And it was this incredibly hopeful period. I don't know what happened between that day and the day where Democrats decided, instead of talking about the benefits that came from our country to moving to talking about the grievances that they faced, they began to create not only this very different set of ideas that seemed to be very negative, but they also began to wall themselves off, close themselves up promote cancel culture. Anybody who said anything that was opposed to it, they were very negative about. And there were many people, I think, who saw that as a violation of free speech. And I think Donald Trump partly won based upon that issue. Maybe it wasn't fair that he did, but nonetheless, I think there were a lot of people who did not like that happening on the left. It seems to me by doing this, he's really undermining the Republicans' party to say that free speech is their issue.
Well, he certainly has abdicated any claim for Republicans being the party of free speech. And I don't think it's just an emotional reaction to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I think it's an attempt to use that event to try to silence critics and suppress opposing viewpoints. And because the attempts on the left to undermine free speech were ideological, but not necessarily policy. They wanted to promote identity politics that evolved into a very restrictive sense of wokeism. But they didn't try to suppress criticism of Obama when he was president, or criticism of Biden who was president on substantive issues. And Trump is attempting to silence critics. And I believe you're absolutely right. I think the woke issue was a significant part of Trump's victory in 2016 and a significant part of his return to office and successful campaign in 2024. And I don't know, logic doesn't necessarily drive the MAGA narrative generally, but I don't know how you can continue to inveigh against wokeism when you're simultaneously trying to kick Jimmy Kimmel off the show and saying, okay, we got Colbert, we got Kimmel, now NBC, and this is the President of the United States speaking, NBC, you need to get rid of Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers. I don't know. Now, there are a few voices. Ted Cruz spoke out. A few other senators have spoke out. This is one of the few times that some Republican office holders have developed at least the semblance of a spine on some issue. But generally, there is a tolerance for weaponizing the federal government to suppress criticism of the government. That's undermining the fundamental premise of American democracy.
So, Bob, I'm going to take this back to something you said last week, and I know that you've been a constant supporter of, which is just this concept of, maybe this is a moment that liberals ought to take a good look at large government and determine whether or not that really does benefit them in the long run. It seems to me, the FCC, I think, is a great example. This all is based upon spectrum, the amount of spectrum that is given out by the United States government, and they're agreeing that believing that they have the right to be able to give that to networks, and that what networks need to do in exchange for that is they need to provide for a public good. Well, public good's not really easy to define, right? Public good can be something that can be very arguable, and Trump's argument of public good means you only talk good about me, right? There's the public good that he's interested in. Well, we could auction off the spectrum. We could just say, no, we're out of that business. Right? We're going to auction it off, and we're going to let networks own it. We're not going to determine what your public good is. Your thoughts on kind of the idea of maybe we should re-examine even having the role that's being played by them to push it. In the beginning, I think it was designed to try to make certain that they were giving us this 30 minutes of news that was unaffected by ads or other things. But we're way beyond that now.
I would like to see a sharp reduction in the authority of the Federal Communications Commission. And certainly this illustration of the abuse of that power should be a teaching moment for those on both the right and the left. And I do think it's a fascinating question. I mean, a small government conservative is in part a small government conservative because we believe that if you give government great power, you will inevitably get a Trump. That's just built into the nature of large government. It won't always be managed by people of goodwill and with the respect for the constitutional norms that we've tried to establish. And I think there is a huge opportunity here to try to convert those on the left to at least reinforcing the guardrails that limit the power of the federal government. Now that there's been a dramatic illustration with daily examples of how the power of big government can be used in ways that are appalling to small government conservatives, but also threaten what those on the left would like to see. I would hope that there would be some sort of movement developed with considerable funding to invest in that message as to, okay, you've seen what big government can be. Can't we re-reach a consensus on some limits that ought to be imposed on what people can do with that authority?
So, Henry, I'd like your thoughts on that. But, it also seems to me in this equation that this whole issue of federalism, again, that Bob oftentimes talks about, it's a good time to evaluate it. Meaning, it seems like every single week we have a new existential threat, and you're tired of the talk on free speech, but last week it was a different existential threat, and the week before that it was a different one again. But all of them kind of relate back to this concept of we've got this big fight going on at the federal level between a set of values on both sides, and the small government conservative has been forced out. I just keep looking at this and think, hey, maybe this is the right time for liberals to take a look at if we were instead fighting about a lot of these issues on a local level instead of a national level, and the power of the federal government was less, that would also mean the power of the presidency was less. And while that may not serve them well when they think they're going to have the presidency, it's going to serve the overall values and morals that they have to a better degree by not having to have these existential threats on the civil liberties and values that I think liberals actually do value.
Yeah, it's an interesting strategic question for each of the parties, right? About which serves them better across different issue areas, because these are asymmetric costs that come from changing policy. Like, for example, when I hear about the power of the FCC to give or take television licenses, I'm pretty sure the Republicans at this point would be comfortable basically shutting down all the network television stations because all of them are relatively biased towards the Democrats, and Republicans don't watch them. And the big base of support for the Republicans is in cable television and, most importantly, in podcasts and other online news sources, right? And so the Republicans have relatively little to lose from overregulation, from that burdens these public television stations. Whereas the Democrats, I think that these shows, to the extent that anyone still watches them, Paul, I'm like you, I find them boring. I think to the extent that anyone still watches them, they're Democrats. And so the Democrats probably would prefer to keep them alive, whereas the Republicans don't care. But then when you flip over to the other side of the equation and you think about the size of the executive in general, I don't think the Democrats have really come to terms with the fact that you have a new Republican Party that's very comfortable with making very forceful use of the executive branch to try and shape the economy and society to its urges, right, to its preferred vision in a way that the Democrats have been comfortable doing since the New Deal. So I think that we are entering a new stage of strategic competition between the parties. And maybe if the Republicans are so comfortable very forcefully using the executive to intervene in the economy, to pick winners and losers in the economy, to pick winners and losers in media and other cultural institutions, maybe it is in the Democrats' best interests to start to rein in the size of the executive and the power of the executive. But I'd say that is a big strategic change that would take a very long time, maybe decades, for the Republicans to force the Democrats to change their stance on that issue.
All right, so I'm going to give you my thoughts, and this is advice to the Democratic Party, of which I'm no longer a part. I'm the chairman of this No Labels Party, and if they want to continue to commit political suicide, that is up to them. In fact, I don't think I have any choice in terms of what they're doing on it. But I would have them look back in their history, and I would start with, if I were them, recognizing that they express a lot of concern about where we are, the United States today, and how threatened they feel. They express a lot of concern about that. Yet, I've listened to a lot of them. They want to do nothing to change the playing field. Well, Donald Trump, whether they like it or not, has moved to the left, and he has begun to squeeze them out on issue after issue. Yeah, I go back to Bill Clinton. I knew Bill Clinton. I watched him work. I watched him work up close. Bill Clinton, regardless of what position he had, he was intensely aware of the divisions that existed in America. And in understanding them, he did not make it his goal to demonize the other side, because he also understood that in doing that, he would lose a large portion of the public. So instead, he spent time trying to figure out how to pull them in, pull them towards his side. Now, it shouldn't be lost, that was the president who not only said the era of big government is over, we're going to reform welfare as we know it. He also was the last president to have a balanced budget. He did that because he understood the importance of trying to pull the two sides together. Democrats have taken this position of they want to maintain all of their existing positions because they believe they're morally right, which, by the way, sounds a lot to me like the people that they complain about on the right side, who they think they're morally right. They want to do nothing to open up the sphere and think about this different from a strategy standpoint. But if I were giving them advice, the idea that they began to adopt the theory of smaller government, that would be a game changer. That would dramatically shift what's happened. Now, it may do ill or well for them. I'm not certain, right? It would be a different game. But right now, all the rules are being changed by Donald Trump. He's running both political parties today. He's not just running the Republican Party, he's running the Democratic Party also, because the response is a full-time response about how much they hate him with no real clear agenda as to where they're going, other than them knowing they have to continue to march further to the left to appease their base, while knowing that there's no real room for them to go on other issues that were considered more mainstream economic issues or political issues, because he's already beginning to capture them.
Well, I agree with what you said about Trump. The Democrats have become reactive. They had an election campaign in 2024 that was quite unsuccessful, that was based in some ways around themes that we discussed on this show, ironically, around the threats to democracy and liberal institutions that Trump poses. It didn't resonate with voters. People didn't care. They failed. And in addition, a lot of their coalition around minorities and women and low-income voters seems to be breaking up and moving towards the Republicans. So at the moment, they are reactive. They are reacting to what Donald Trump says. Now, of course, it would be better to not be reactive, but you have to have a plan. And I agree with you, John. Paul, they could come up with a better plan. But it's not as simple as simply coming up with a better plan. As you know, there are interest groups that are highly organized and mobilized within the Democratic Party, pushing for what they want. And they have been institutionalized over many decades, and they are not going to change their policy demands of the party quickly. I read recently that the party can't even decide on a draft schedule for the primaries for the 2028 presidential race. I think that a lot of these things are going to have to play themselves out through really hard knuckle fights within the Democratic Party. And at the moment, it's simply impossible to tell which direction those fights are going to take. But my read is that this early debate about the scheduling of the primaries, because it reflects the power of different interest groups depending on which states vote first, I think that could be one of the early competitions where we start to see a little bit of an indication of the intra-party wrestling match, who's getting the upper hand. And so I think we should all be looking for signs, reading the tea leaves to try and work out which direction the party is going to go. And I don't think we can just read op-eds in the New York Times and hope to know which one of them is the new blueprint for the Democratic Party. I think this is going to be a more hard knuckle fight because the stakes are so high for the different interest groups within the party.
Bob, it seems interesting to me that Trump was able to move the Republican Party dramatically. I mean, if we went back 8 years ago to know where the Republican Party was, the party of Ronald Reagan, I find it fun to listen to people who say Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan were a lot the same. There's nothing that compares those two on tariffs, on immigration, on small government, on what we're doing on taxes. There's just nothing that seems to me to be truly comparable. But he moved them. This wasn't just something that happened in the Republican Party organically. I'm interested in your thoughts about how he did that. I mean, if Henry's right, and this is just a big play of interest groups inside the Democratic Party, there were interest groups inside the Republican Party. Is there something different about the nature of Republicans that they're just going to follow the leader when he begins to make those choices? Or do you see that that this just took work on Trump's side? Whether we agree with Trump on the issues or not, we have to acknowledge he was incredibly successful at moving the party to where he wanted them to be as opposed to where they were.
No question about it. He has transformed the Reagan conservative party into a populist nationalist party. And he has taken a Republican grassroots that used to be very ideologically oriented. If you stepped out of line on any of a variety of issues, you would hear from the grassroots right into more of a cult-like support for an individual. I think it was attributable to some of the stuff that we have talked about. I think it was a combination of anti-wokeism and the fact that Trump was the guy who would stand up to wokeism harder, more vigorously than anybody else in the Republican Party. Immigration, a sense of economic loss, particularly in rural America, that made the traditional conservative grassroots constituency susceptible to and supportive of a populist nationalist message. And I think that is what explains. And Trump was the one genius that Trump has is playing that song to that constituency. There is utterly no one, even able to stand on the same stage as he, in terms of singing that populist nationalist song in a way that gets people to cheer and support him and follow. So I believe it was a combination of his unique political skills, along with an ideological transformation that occurred that was based upon the rise of wokeism, the rise of immigration as an issue, and economic dislocation, particularly in rural America.
Yeah, and what I see is, again, why I say he's moved to the left. So take the religious community. they may not want to admit to this, but Donald Trump moved them on the issues of gay rights, party on gay rights, and he also moved the party on the abortion issue. They think, well, he gave it back to the states. Yeah, he gave it back to the states, but he's kind of maintained in many ways, just by saying he wants to have it being decided by the states, a little bit more of a moderate left position, because he really isn't talking about being pro-life. He's not advocating those issues the way that Reagan did. On the issues of our allies, I think the Republican Party for a very long period of time have been supporters of Western democratic values. They've been the ones out there advocating about peace through strength. Well, we're not really about peace through strength anymore. In fact, I'm not quite sure if he wouldn't fit into the 60s hippie movement on this, of, the idea that we need to have peace regardless. And I hope he's successful at it. I mean, I definitely would like peace. It's just everything that I know about our successes in the past was they always came about only through strength. But nonetheless, that's been a movement to the left. Issue of immigration. A lot of people think that is a right-wing issue, but I can tell you back in the 90s, I was dealing with organized labor, and there were many organized labor groups who had a lot of opposition to what was happening on the immigration issue. Tariffs, the same thing is true. So the thing that I see is, when I look at this, is, well, what are you going to take advantage of as opportunities to try and change the playing field if you're the Democratic Party? Now, we talked about small government, but you wrote an article this week about the issue of inflation. I happen to think that there's an ability for the Democratic Party there to be successful as well. Probably comes by being more about small government. But would you talk about your article on inflation and the point that you were trying to make?
It was basically a dissent from the Fed reducing the Fed rate in response to what's occurring in the labor markets. Before we have actually gotten inflation back under the Fed target of 2%, which I actually think is too high of a target. Along with Paul Volcker, I think the actual goal should be 0% inflation and a currency that retains its value as much as possible over time. There's simply nothing about what currently is stagnating the labor market that a cut in the Fed rate ameliorates. It's tariff uncertainty. It's uncertainty about the growing tendency of the Trump administration to want a share of revenues or a share of companies in order to provide government approvals. We had this week the Trump administration exercising the golden share that they have in U.S. Steel to forbid U.S. Steel from closing a particular plant, which sort of isn't the light hand in economic regulation that would be the Reagan legacy, and that people, I think, falsely believe that the Trump administration, as a general matter, is supporting. Meanwhile, inflation remains stubbornly stuck at 2.5% to 3%, irrespective of the measure that you want to use to determine what the rate is. And there's been no movement in it. We're now in the fifth year of interest rates being above the Fed target. And the current interest rate is not historically high. It's in fact pretty much at the historical norm. And the Fed balance sheet remains extremely high. So if anything, we actually have kind of a lax monetary policy rather than a restrictive one. So I was, although since the article has appeared, there's been more people who have sort of weighed in, expressing skepticism about what the Fed is doing. The Economist said it should be one and done. The Wall Street Journal editorial page has expressed a similar skepticism. And I just think the Fed can, if it wants to, if it has the will, it can bring inflation under control. It can't fix the uncertainty that's ruling the labor markets. And so I think we've made a fundamental step in the wrong direction, which seems to be a commitment to make at least 2 additional steps in the wrong direction before the end of the year.
So here's when I look at this politically, or at least what I'm thinking about when thinking about the Democratic Party and moving on this. This is also an admission, or a partial admission by Trump, that his economic policies aren't doing so well, right? I mean, why do you need to lower interest rates? One of the reasons to keep them at a moderately high level is eventually all economies have a problem. All of them do. And as sure as the economy goes down, it will come back up again. But one of the ways that the feds are able to combat that is if they have powder, dry powder, to be able to go in and lower interest rates and stimulate the economy. That's if you continue to chip away at the interest rates, that becomes increasingly more difficult to do. And I don't know that they can do another round of quantitative easing like they did last time, where they just simply add debt to the balance sheet. My point is that I don't think Trump can quite escape the idea that if he's pushing for lower interest rates almost at a panic level, that he's at some level also admitting that his policies of tariffs and increased government spending are not necessarily working. A big portion of our economy is being subsidized by the amount of spending that we've had. Again, back to the Clinton administration, we saw this great exchange between the Federal Reserve and the president, where the Federal Reserve was saying, look, if you lower government spending, I can lower interest rates. And the connection of those two help create a better economy. I think the point that we're taking on here is a president that's a little bit panicked that his policies really aren't working, regardless of how much hype he tries to give them.
Trump's a easy money guy. So I think irrespective of what economic conditions were, and how wildly inappropriate easy money is, he would be in favor of that. And he doesn't believe in the Fed's independence. So he wants to, it's in part a power play. In addition, I think you're correct. It is in part an admission that his economic policies are not working. But I think he would be making this push even if the economy was doing well, because he believes in easy money and he doesn't believe in the independence of the Fed. And the problem with the Democrats trying to take advantage of this issue is that the Democrats also have tended to be easy money advocates, and also don't really believe in the independence of the Fed. Elizabeth Warren has proposed many reforms that would impose left-wing economic policy on the Fed. And so the Democrats aren't really in a position, I don't believe, to seize the banner of stable money and independent Fed. But I don't think they need to be, because Trump owns this economy. And if that's an issue in the midterm elections, it will benefit Democrats whether they deserve it or not.
Yeah, and I guess the point that I was trying to make on this is that if they create a fundamental shift, the Democratic Party began to point out, hey, look, one of the things that we're finding is through these arguments about free speech, the misuses of government that we see that are going on, we believe that we need to focus more on a smaller federal government. There are a variety of reasons to do that. If they actually began to make that a cornerstone, then all of a sudden arguing about deficit reduction and putting themselves into a position with a balanced budget, they'd be more credible on. The idea that they would be better equipped to deal with the economy, they would have a better ability to argue. I think that as long as they stay in the position that they're in, you're correct. They're going to have a very difficult time trying to prove that we're better on the economy. Now, They may not need to. They may be able to say, well, this guy's such a disaster that we should be the right group. But if the economy just kind of skips along at a 1% growth and he can convince the public, well, I might be bad, but those socialists are going to be a lot worse, I think that they're going to have a difficult time making their case.
The thing about Jerome Powell at the moment is he gives Trump a very useful scapegoat. He can talk about Powell's high interest rates, in his view, as the reason for why the economy is not doing so great, right? And so at the moment, Bob says this is Trump's economy, but Trump says, no, this is Jerome Powell's economy. And so it's a very convenient dodge for him at the moment. Now, whether the Democrats can capitalize on inflation, Paul, I'm a little dubious. I mean, the Biden administration was the one that's so clearly associated with inflation for most Americans. I think most Americans feel that price increases are stable now. They're sure there's inflation. People feel that, but it's not like it was under the Biden administration. So if I was the Democrats, I would not bring up the issue of inflation at all. I would try and avoid it. It really leaves a lane open for the Republicans there. So I can see why Trump still likes this issue, why he likes to hammer on Jerome Powell as a scapegoat for the economy not doing as well as it should, by his view. It seems to work for him. But at the end of the day, as we discussed here many times, most of the job growth during the Biden administration was actually in federal government jobs and in healthcare. And Trump has radically reduced the number of federal government jobs. So federal hiring has been in the deep freeze. They've laid off a lot of workers, including through DOGE and these other initiatives. And then he's also massively cut immigration levels. And so I think that between those two things, they're going to lead to a sluggishness in the economy. It would probably be smart for Trump to keep talking about Jerome Powell instead of talking about his economic policies for as long as he possibly can.
Do you think, though, he loses some of that? We have this appeal that he's had on Lisa Cook, the concept of that she was guilty of mortgage fraud. And then, of course, people are pointing out that 3 or 4 members of his cabinet reported inaccurate forms in the exact same way, and a judge has said she wasn't guilty of it. But Steve Moran is, in my opinion, a further step from his standpoint where he'll have less of an ability to blame it on the feds. Steve, Moran, which has been one of Trump's close confidants on the economy, he still works inside the Trump administration. I guess he's going to hold both titles at the same time. He's the guy that's been advocating not only for cheaper credit, but for a weaker dollar. In fact, he has even taken aim at whether or not we should be the world's reserve currency and expressed in a number of his writings that may be doing us damage. Well, if that ends up becoming the overall economic theory of the new feds underneath Trump, I think his problems are going to multiply. I think all of our problems are going to multiply. But it also gives him less of an ability to blame them. Would you agree?
Right. Well, I actually think that those sorts of things are hurting Trump more among elites and probably on the bond markets than they are with the mass public, right? So bond traders notice that the independence of the Fed is slowly being called into question. They're going to therefore demand higher interest rates for the US government when it's trying to borrow. But I don't think that your average man on the street, average voter, knows the names of these people or understand these dynamics. I think what they're really looking at are cost of living, inflation as they actually experience it. And if Trump keeps hammering on the Fed and Jerome Powell, they probably will remember who that is as well. At least it's much more likely that they'll remember those things than they will remember this inside baseball about who happens to be on the Fed and who doesn't. Just as an aside, by the way, Paul, it's not that long ago that we were reading relatively credulous coverage of modern monetary theory. I would remind you this idea, this left-wing idea that governments can spend as much money as they want if they have an independent central bank. This was a very popular idea for about the first 6 months of the Biden presidency until they got all the spending bills passed and inflation started to skyrocket. I don't think I've heard of that idea since, because it turns out that you can actually have inflation in response or correlated with government spending. So the fact that the Republicans are getting a little kooky in their economic ideas, and things are not quite as the University of Chicago econ faculty would like them to be. They're not the only ones in that boat. The Democrats have pushed that one out pretty far themselves, I would say.
I hope you're not trying to make me feel better by telling me that they're both a little kooky.
Yeah, take your pick. Take your pick, Paul. Economic nationalism or modern monetary theory. It's like, as the Germans would say, do you want poison or cyanide?
There you go. All right. So Henry, last week we started talking about this, and it definitely intensified since then. I sent you all the Economist article. I thought it was a great position, which is that Europe, and namely England, hates Trump, but they're starting to emulate him. They talked about the protests that were on the street with people talking about the issues of not only immigration, but kind of furthering the ideas of nationalism through Brexit, which, if you really look at the numbers, I don't think it's worked all that well for Britain. But nonetheless, if you look at it from a political standpoint, those streets were pretty full. There still seems to be a large group of people who think that somehow or another, if they're poking their finger in the other country's eye, somehow or another, they're going to do better. Your thoughts on that? And not only there, but what we're seeing in other places around the world.
Yeah, this is a global transition to some sort of new era of populist politics. Now, how this plays itself out, how long it takes, I think it's all up for grabs. But at the moment, Nigel Farage's party is polling, I think, at above 30% in the UK. If they had an election tomorrow, he would be the new prime minister. But it's a pretty old party system in the UK. There have been new parties crop up and go away again. The Social Democrats, I believe, in the 1980s were quite popular. I think at one point even polled something like 50% during the Thatcher governments in the 1980s. So there is a precedent for parties to pop up between elections and then sort of go away again. And there's not going to be an election for 4 years in the UK. And so there's a lot of time for Farage to make mistakes, essentially, and for voters to go home to the Tories, to the Conservatives. So I wouldn't bet my house on Farage being the next prime minister, but I do think that a lot of these populist themes are not going anywhere, right? Whether you look at the UK, the US, Germany, France, I think that this is a new feature of our politics, as we've talked about on this show a lot, and we're all still trying to make sense of it.
Do you think that part of it is, I mean, one of the things not lost on me is that we have a demographic shift that's happening throughout the world. Most countries are actually so low in childbirth that they're losing population. And the way that they've tried to make up for it has been through immigration. It was noticeable to me that we may, the United States, now be in the first period of time where we're actually going to see negative, not only job growth, but maybe less people. But there's this tension between the loss of demographics and the growth that comes organically through a population where childbirth is more focused on. And at the same time, if you substitute that with immigration, you oftentimes begin to have an effect on cultural issues, assimilation, people not feeling comfortable with the new people coming in. In the United States, that's been Mexico. But in Europe, it's been a large portion of it's been the Muslim population. And I know that I have friends in France who are every bit as anti-immigrant as any MAGA member that you might find here, based upon what they're seeing with the Muslim population. Do you think that is one of the major drivers, or do you see it being other things throughout Europe?
I think this shift is what we call in social science overdetermined, meaning there are so many huge causal factors that all seem to be pushing in the same direction. It's hard to work out which one is causing what. Certainly immigration is a huge driver. You just have to look at, for example, the rise of the AfD in Germany. It basically corresponds with Merkel's opening to a lot of immigrants from Syria and North Africa and the Middle East around 2014 and 2015. There's definitely a clear correlation. But then there's a lot of research that thinks it's more about globalization and the decline in manufacturing jobs. There's other people that think it's about social media, cable news, how people are getting their political information. Here in the United States, we sometimes point to things like the primary system, right, that we've talked about a lot. because it leads to candidates taking really extreme positions. So it's overdetermined, right? There are so many forces pushing these developments that it's hard to put your finger on one specific one. But they all seem to be leading to this paradigm shift or a change in the structure of our politics, in the way that the basic party systems and people's voter allegiances are made up. And that's I think, one of the underlying causes of a lot of the social problems, social unrest that we see in our societies today.
There may be many factors in play, as there always are in politics, but absent the issue of immigration, I don't think you would see these populist nationalist parties as being on the verge of achieving power, the way that we're seeing in so many countries in Western Europe. So I do believe that you have the economic factors. I believe you have cultural factors. But I think the true gasoline for the populist nationalist movement in Europe is immigration. It's even more of a factor there than in the United States, where I think anti-wokeism was also an accelerant to the transformation. In Europe, I think without the immigration issue, these would mostly remain fringe political movements rather than movements on the verge of achieving control and power.
All right, we're past the hour, so I'd like to thank both of you guys for being here today, and we will see you guys next week with a new edition of New Frontiers. But gentlemen, thank the both of you. Bob, enjoy that nice cold weather up in Munns Park. That's nice. We're still down in Phoenix, and the humidity here is still getting us a little bit. Henry, keep riding that bike. You know, you're young. You might as well get all the miles in you can while you can.
Of course. Hey, Paul, I'm too cheap to pay for parking, let's be honest.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Take care.
See ya.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.